I thought he loved me, and I thought I knew him.
For 9 years, I thought I knew my husband better than I knew myself. I told people that like it was a compliment, like it proved something about the kind of love we had. I said it at dinner parties, half a glass of wine in, watching people's faces soften with something between admiration and envy. I said it in the quiet dark of our bedroom, half asleep, his hand resting on my back like it belonged there. I believed it so completely, so unquestioningly, that when the truth finally showed itself, I didn't recognize it. I mistook it for a stranger breaking into my life, when really, it had been living in my house the entire time, sitting across from me at breakfast, folding my laundry, memorizing the sound of my voice when I was afraid. This is the story of how I found out that the man I married had never once loved me. Not the way I understood love to work. Not as a feeling that arrives and stays because of who you are, unconditionally, imperfectly, the way real love is supposed to. What Julian felt for me, if you can even call it that, only ever existed because I believed in it. The moment I stopped believing, so did he. That's not a marriage. That's a magic trick performed slowly enough that you never see the sleight of hand, and I was the only person in the room who didn't know she was watching one. I want to tell you exactly how it happened. Not the version I told my friends in the early months, carefully edited to protect my own dignity. Not the version I told myself for years afterward to make it hurt less. The real one. Every uncomfortable, humiliating, quietly devastating piece of it. Because somewhere in this story, I think you'll recognize someone. Maybe someone you loved. Maybe, if you're honest with yourself in the quiet moments, the ones you don't say out loud, even to the people closest to you, someone you still do. There's a particular kind of silence that settles over a house after a marriage ends the way mine did. Not with shouting, not with slammed doors or thrown dishes, or the neighbors calling to check if everyone's okay. My marriage ended in near total silence, which is, I've come to understand, its own kind of violence. The violence of realizing that the loudest, most consequential event of your adult life happened almost entirely inside your own head, while the person across the table simply continued eating his dinner. Before I tell you how it ended, you need to understand how it began, because the ending, I've come to believe, was written long before I ever saw it coming, long before I even met him, if I'm honest. The ending was written in a childhood I knew almost nothing about, in a set of lessons a much younger version of Julian Hartwell learned about what it takes to be loved, lessons he carried into every room he ever walked into afterward, including the one where he first saw me. Here's what I didn't know. Sitting across from Julian Hartwell on our first date, laughing at a joke he'd clearly told before, watching the candlelight catch the side of his face and thinking, with a certainty that embarrasses me now, this is different, this one is real. I didn't know that the version of him I was falling for had been built, piece by piece, conversation by conversation, need by need, specifically for me. I didn't know that 9 years later I would find a card in the bottom drawer of his home office, tucked beneath old tax documents, with handwriting that wasn't quite his, a version of his own signature I'd never seen before, practiced and unfamiliar, like a man rehearsing being someone else in private. I didn't know that the question I would eventually have to ask him, across our own kitchen table, wasn't going to be, who is she, or how long has this been going on? The questions I'd always assumed would be the hardest ones a wife could ask. The question I actually needed answered turned out to be much simpler, and infinitely harder to survive. Did you ever love me, or did you just need me to believe you did? I didn't know, sitting in that restaurant 9 years earlier, that I was about to spend the better part of a decade as the audience for a performance so total, so meticulously calibrated, that even the people closest to us, my own sister, my closest friends, would spend years telling me how lucky I was, how rare it was to find a man who saw me the way Julian did. 3 things happened over the course of our marriage that I want you to hold on to now, because they'll come back later, and when they do, I think you'll feel exactly what I felt when I finally understood what they meant. A phone that wasn't supposed to exist, hidden beneath a stack of receipts he had no real reason to keep. A friend of mine, my oldest friend, someone who'd known me since college, who went quiet, carefully and consistently, every single time his name came up. And one specific night I will never fully stop replaying, when I stood at the bottom of our staircase and heard him speak to someone else in a voice I had never once heard him use with me in 9 years of marriage. Warm, unguarded, real, in a way that made everything before it feel suddenly, sickeningly rehearsed. I promise you, by the end of this, you will understand exactly why that voice, not an affair, not a lie, just a voice, was the single most devastating thing I have ever heard in my life. I met Julian at a dinner party I almost didn't go to. I was 32, living alone in a condo I'd bought myself 2 years earlier, a small but genuine point of pride I mention probably too often at parties. I was recently out of what I can only describe, even now, as a long, quiet loneliness. Not a bad relationship, not heartbreak in the traditional sense, just an absence of one. The kind of absence that doesn't announce itself as a problem until you're sitting alone at another Friday night dinner, glass of wine in hand, telling yourself you're fine, you're independent, you don't need anyone to complete you, while some small, honest part of you quietly disagrees. I want to be truthful about that, because I think it matters for everything that comes after. I wasn't desperate, I wasn't broken, not in any way I could have named at the time. I had a career in healthcare administration I was genuinely proud of, a condo I'd furnished slowly and carefully with things I actually loved, friends who showed up for me in the ways that count. But there was a specific kind of hunger living in me that I didn't have a name for yet, not the hunger to be liked or admired or even desired in the ordinary sense, but the hunger to be truly known by someone, not the polished version of myself I presented at work, or even the warmer version my friends knew. The whole, unpolished, occasionally embarrassing truth of who I actually was. My friend Renata dragged me to that dinner party. I remember almost canceling twice that day. Once because of a headache that wasn't really a headache, and once because I genuinely couldn't think of a single thing I wanted to talk about with strangers for 3 hours. Renata told me, in the exact tone she still uses when she's not going to take no for an answer, that I was coming whether I liked it or not, and that if I hated it, she'd owe me brunch. I've thought about that ordinary, forgettable exchange more times than I can count in the years since. How close I came to simply staying home. Julian sat across the table from me that night, next to a mutual friend of the host, and within 20 minutes, he had asked me a question no one had ever asked me before. Not, "What do you do?" the question everyone asks, the one that lets you perform a version of your resume out loud, but what did you want to be before you knew what was practical? I remember laughing, half out of surprise, and telling him, half embarrassed, the way you are when you admit something you gave up on long ago, that I'd wanted to be a marine biologist, that I used to fall asleep as a kid to documentaries about the ocean floor, the strange bioluminescent creatures living in total darkness a mile beneath the surface, fascinated by the idea that there was an entire world down there that most people would never see. He didn't laugh. He didn't do the polite, slightly distracted nod most people give an answer like that, before moving the conversation somewhere more familiar. He looked at me, really looked, in a way I hadn't been looked at in longer than I wanted to admit, and said, "I think most people give up the version of themselves that was actually most interesting, because it stopped being convenient." And then quieter, almost like he was talking to himself as much as to me. "I don't think you should have given that up. I know now, with 9 years of hindsight and a great deal of pain purchased at full price, that this wasn't curiosity in the way I understood it that night. It was reconnaissance. It was the first move in a process Julian had clearly performed before, refined before, and would go on to perform again after me. But at the time, at the time, it felt like the first genuinely real conversation I'd had with another human being in years. Over the following months, Julian became fluent in me, in a way that felt, at every step, like intimacy, rather than what I now understand it actually was, a kind of quiet, patient data collection. He learned the songs I loved, the ones I'd mentioned once, almost in passing, and started sending them to me at exactly the right moments. A Tuesday afternoon, when I'd had a hard day at work. A Sunday morning when I was feeling nostalgic for no reason I could name. He learned that I pull away when I'm overwhelmed, That my instinct under stress is to go quiet and create distance, and instead of chasing me the way past partners had, which only ever made me pull further away, he did something that felt, at the time, like remarkable emotional maturity. He'd simply say, "Take the space you need. I'll be here when you're ready," and then actually mean it, actually wait, without a single trace of resentment when I came back, which of course made me chase him. Instead, made me want to close the distance faster than I ever had with anyone. He learned that my mother had died when I was in college, a sophomore, 20 years old, blindsided by a diagnosis that moved faster than any of us were prepared for, and that I had never fully grieved her, had instead built a quiet, efficient wall around that entire period of my life, the way you do when grief arrives, while you're still supposed to be finishing exams and figuring out your major. One night, 7 months into dating, without me asking, without any prompting at all, Julian sat with me on my couch and simply asked me to tell him about her, not the sanitized version I gave at parties when someone asked, "So are your parents still around?" but the real one, what she smelled like. The specific, ordinary things she used to say. What I missed most on an average Tuesday, not just on the anniversary of her death. I cried for the first time in almost a decade, fully, without editing myself, while he held me and said almost nothing at all, which somehow felt like exactly the right thing. Everyone around me said some version of the same thing that year. My sister Denise said it at Thanksgiving, watching Julian clear the table without being asked. My friends said it over brunch, watching him remember, unprompted, that one of them was lactose intolerant and had quietly arranged for a dairy-free dessert. "You're so lucky," they said, again and again, in different words that all meant the same thing. He really sees you. I want you to sit with that phrase for a moment, because it's going to matter more than you think it does right now, more than it mattered to any of us at the time. He really sees you. What none of us understood, not my friends, not my sister, not even me, not for the better part of a decade, is that there is a difference between being seen and being studied. One comes from love, offered without agenda, the natural byproduct of someone paying attention because they simply want to. The other only looks like love, from the outside, and even from the inside, right up until the moment it doesn't need to look like anything anymore. We got married 18 months after that dinner party, in a small ceremony at a botanical garden outside Charlotte, the kind of wedding people describe as intimate, when they mean it was smaller than expected, but somehow felt bigger than any large wedding they'd been to. Fast, some people said. My mother-in-law, who I'd meet exactly 4 times before the wedding, said it with a raised eyebrow that I chose, at the time, to interpret as simple surprise, rather than something closer to warning. But it didn't feel fast to me. It felt inevitable, the way certain relationships do when you're inside them, like we'd simply been waiting for the paperwork, the ceremony, the legal architecture of marriage, to catch up to something that had already been true between us for a long time. The first year of our marriage is the one I've replayed the most in the years since, turning it over and over in my mind like a stone I keep expecting to look different in new light. Because it's the year where, if I look closely enough now, with everything I know today, I can see the first small cracks in the foundation. The ones I explained away so easily, so automatically at the time, that I barely remember doing it. That's the part that still unsettles me most. Not that the signs were there, but how effortlessly I dismissed each one, individually, in real time, without ever once connecting them into a pattern. There was the night, maybe 4 months into the marriage, when I asked him, casually, the way you ask your husband things over dinner, about his childhood. Not for any particular reason. I think a coworker had mentioned her own difficult upbringing that day, and it had put me in a reflective mood. Julian gave me an answer so smooth, so complete, so seemingly generous with detail, that it took me literally years to notice what was actually missing from it. There was no specific memory in it. No smell of a particular kitchen on Sunday mornings. No name of a childhood best friend. No story with the kind of small, strange, unnecessary detail that makes a memory feel lived in rather than described. Just a warm, general, impressionistic shape of a happy enough childhood. Loving parents, a comfortable house. Nothing dramatic, delivered with the polish of something that had been said before, many times, refined down to its most palatable form. There was the way he talked about his ex-girlfriend, the serious one before me, a woman named Whitney. He mentioned maybe 3 times in our entire courtship, and always in the same clipped, faintly pained way. Vague, unspecific, subtly implying without ever quite stating that she'd been unstable, needy, difficult to be with. It just wasn't healthy for either of us, he told me once, with the practiced sadness of someone who delivered that exact sentence before. I believed him completely, without a flicker of doubt, the way you believe someone you love when they tell you a story about their own past. Because why would you assume anything else? It would be years, nearly 7 of them, before I met a mutual acquaintance at a work conference who, upon learning Julian's name, said unprompted, "Oh, I actually knew his ex, Whitney, the sweetest person, honestly." We were all so confused when they broke up. Nobody really understood what happened. And then there was the smaller thing, the thing I almost don't want to admit I noticed and dismissed dozens of times over that first year. Because admitting I noticed it means admitting I chose not to look at it directly. Julian forgot promises, not the big ones. He never once forgot an anniversary, a birthday, an event that carried social weight or visible consequence if missed. The small ones, a dinner reservation he swore, with complete conviction, that he'd made, until we arrived to find no record of it, and he'd apologize so warmly, so thoroughly, that the apology itself became a kind of gift, distracting entirely from the broken promise underneath it. A commitment to call his mother on her birthday that somehow, every single year, became my job to remind him of, and then eventually just became my job full stop, until I was the one calling his mother myself, feeling strange and unable to articulate why. Here's the detail that took me the longest to see clearly, the one that still makes something cold settle in my stomach when I think about it now. Every single one of these forgotten promises, if you looked closely enough, if you laid them all out side by side the way I eventually would, benefited him in some small, quiet, almost invisible way. He was never once too tired or too busy to do something that helped him. The forgetting had a shape to it, a consistency, that I simply didn't have the vocabulary to recognize yet, because nothing in my life up to that point had taught me that forgetting could be selective without being conscious, that a person could genuinely sincerely believe they'd simply lost track of something, while some deeper, more self-protective part of them had never actually intended to remember it in the first place. I used to tell people, in that first golden year, that I'd finally been understood, completely, entirely, for the first time in my adult life, by another human being who saw every part of me and stayed anyway. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known with the information I had at the time, is that being understood that completely, that quickly, that seamlessly, isn't always the gift it appears to be. Sometimes it's simply connection, luck, 2 people who happen to fit. But sometimes it's a method, refined over years and past relationships, and I had absolutely no way of knowing, in that first golden year of my marriage, that Julian hadn't fallen in love with me in the way I understood love to work at all. He had simply found, in me, an audience patient enough, hopeful enough, hungry enough, to be known, to believe that the performance in front of her was the truth. I met Julian's mother, Corinne, for the first time about a year into our relationship, at a lunch that I remember, even now, as one of the strangest afternoons of my life, though it took me nearly a decade to understand exactly why. She was warm to me, genuinely, effusively warm, complimenting my dress, asking thoughtful questions about my work, telling Julian within the first 15 minutes that I was exactly the kind of woman he needed. But I remember noticing, even then, something slightly off in the rhythm between her and Julian himself. A kind of careful watchfulness in him that I didn't yet have the vocabulary to name. He answered her questions a beat too quickly, agreed with her opinions a shade too readily, laughed at her jokes with a warmth that felt, in retrospect, identical to the warmth he offered strangers at dinner parties, rather than the easier, more careless warmth you'd expect between a grown man and his own mother. At one point during that lunch, Corinne mentioned, almost in passing, A story about Julian as a boy, something about him winning a spelling bee and coming home to find she'd forgotten to attend because of a work commitment. She told it lightly, laughing at herself. I was such a scattered mother back then, I'm surprised he turned out so well-adjusted. Julian laughed along with her, easily, seamlessly, and changed the subject a moment later to ask about her garden. I didn't think much of it at the time. It was such a small story, told so casually, embedded in an otherwise pleasant afternoon. It would be years, not until that long night at our kitchen table, in fact, when Julian finally described his childhood honestly for the first time. Before I understood that the scattered mother Corinne had described so lightly over lunch was the same mother whose unpredictable, performance-contingent affection had taught her son, so early and so thoroughly, that being loved consistently for exactly who he was could never quite be trusted. I think about that lunch often now. I think about how skillfully both of them, mother and son, had learned to make something clearly painful sound, on the surface, like nothing at all. 6 years in, the marriage looked, from the outside, like the one everyone still envied. We'd bought a house outside Charlotte, the kind with a wraparound porch Julian said he'd always dreamed of as a kid, sitting out there with lemonade on hot summer evenings, though I'd later learn, from Corbin, that he'd said the exact same thing, almost word for word, about a different porch, in a different house, in a different life, to a different woman entirely. We hosted dinners other couples talked about for weeks afterward. We took the kind of vacation photos that made people comment, unprompted, on how happy we looked, how easy it seemed between us. My sister Denise still describes that period, even now, as the years you two seemed unbreakable. And I understand why she says it. Because from where she stood, watching from the outside, that's exactly what it looked like. I want to walk you through how it started, because I've told this part of the story so many times in my own head that I know exactly where the first thread came loose. It started with a phone. I wasn't looking for anything. I want to be completely clear about that because I've heard the story get twisted, even in my own memory over the years, into something where I was suspicious all along, quietly hunting for evidence, building a case from the very beginning. I wasn't. I was looking for my car charger, which I'd lent Julian weeks earlier and never gotten back, digging through the bottom drawer of his home office on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon while he was at the gym. And instead of a charger, I found a second phone, an older model, several generations behind the one he actually used, password protected, tucked beneath a stack of receipts and old warranty cards he had absolutely no practical reason to keep. I stood there in his office for a long moment just looking at it, this small dark rectangle that suddenly felt heavier in my hand than its actual weight. I didn't confront him. Not that night. Not that week. I told myself there were 100 reasonable explanations for it. An old work phone from a previous job, kept out of habit. A backup device for photos. Something boring and forgettable that I was about to make strange by asking about it. I put it back exactly where I'd found it, angled the same way, buried beneath the same receipts, and told myself, quite deliberately, that I had imagined the weight of it in my hand, imagined the small, cold drop in my stomach when I first saw it. But something had shifted, in the way these things do, quietly, almost imperceptibly, and then all at once. Once you see one thing you genuinely cannot explain, you start noticing all the other things you'd already, quietly, unconsciously explained away for years, without ever adding them up into a single picture. I noticed that Julian's actual phone, the one I saw every day, charging on his nightstand, sitting face up on the kitchen counter while he cooked, was face down more often than it used to be. Not dramatically. Not in a way that would have seemed strange to anyone who wasn't already looking for something. Just slightly more often, a small shift in habit I might have missed entirely if I hadn't already found the other one. I noticed that he'd started taking calls on the back porch, sliding door closed behind him, in a tone of voice I told myself again and again was just work stress, the particular low, controlled register people use when they don't want to be overheard, which I had, until that point, simply never applied to my own husband, because why would I have? I noticed more than anything the way my closest friend Renata, The same Renata who'd dragged me to that dinner party 9 years earlier, who'd known me since college, who I trusted more than almost anyone alive, would go quiet in this specific, careful way whenever Julian's name came up in conversation. Not hostile, not cold, just withholding in a way that felt deliberate, like she was choosing her words the way you choose them when you're standing near a wound you don't want to reopen for someone else. I asked her about it once, directly, over coffee, and she deflected so smoothly, so casually, that I almost believed I'd imagined that too. Except I hadn't, and some part of me, even then, knew it. 3 weeks after I found the phone, I heard him. I'd come home early that day. A meeting had been canceled at the last minute, the kind of small scheduling accident that changes the entire shape of a life without announcing itself as significant. I remember pulling into the driveway, noticing Julian's car already there. He'd told me he'd be at the gym until 6, and feeling only mild curiosity, nothing more, as I let myself in through the front door. The house was quiet in that particular way. A house is quiet when someone inside it doesn't know they're not alone. I heard his voice before I saw him. Coming from the back porch, the sliding door cracked open just enough to let the sound through, and it stopped me completely at the bottom of the stairs, one hand still resting on the banister, like a physical hand had reached out and pressed against my chest. It was warm, not performed warm, not the practiced, generous gentleness I had grown so completely accustomed to over 9 years, that I had genuinely stopped noticing it as a choice, as something constructed rather than simply felt. This was different, unguarded, easy, in a way that had a looseness to it I hadn't heard from him in longer than I could actually pinpoint. He laughed at something. Really laughed. Not the warm chuckle he gave at dinner parties, not the practiced amusement he offered when I told a joke, but an actual, full, surprised laugh. The kind that used to be for me, back in the very beginning. Back when I still believed, without question, that it was only ever for me. I stood at the bottom of those stairs for what felt like an hour, but was probably closer to 90 seconds, frozen, listening to my own husband's real voice for what I would later come to understand might have been the first time in years. And in those 90 seconds, something in me understood the truth of it before my conscious mind had caught up enough to name it. I didn't know yet who he was talking to. I didn't know what it meant, not fully, not the whole shape of it, not the history behind it. But I knew that voice. I recognized it, with a kind of sick, immediate clarity, as the voice of a man who was not performing, and the vertiginous, stomach-dropping realization that came flooding in behind that recognition was simple and total, and has never fully left me since. If that was his real voice, unguarded and easy and warm without effort, then what, exactly, had I been listening to for 9 years? I didn't confront him that day either. I went back out the front door as quietly as I'd come in, sat in my car in the driveway for almost 20 minutes with the engine off, my hands shaking slightly, in a way I remember being surprised by, and then I drove around the neighborhood for another half hour before coming back inside, letting the door close loudly enough this time that he'd hear me, giving him whatever time he needed to end the call and compose whatever version of himself he was about to show me next. That night, after he'd gone to bed, falling asleep with an ease that felt, for the first time in our marriage, faintly obscene to me, I sat downstairs alone with my laptop and started a folder. I didn't have a name for it yet. I called it something meaningless, something I wouldn't recognize if he ever scrolled past it, a string of letters that meant nothing to anyone but me. I just knew, with a certainty I couldn't fully explain even to myself, that I needed somewhere to put the things I couldn't otherwise explain. The phone, the porch calls, Renata's careful silence, the voice I'd heard through that cracked sliding door. I didn't know yet what I was building a case for. I only knew, sitting there at 2 in the morning with the house silent around me and my husband sleeping peacefully upstairs, that I could not stop. Something had already started that I no longer had the ability to reverse, even if some part of me, a tired, frightened, still hopeful part, wanted desperately to put the phone back one more time and simply choose, again, to believe. Over the following weeks, I became someone I didn't fully recognize. I found myself checking the location history on our shared family app, under the guise of safety, something we'd set up years earlier during a period when a string of break-ins had hit our neighborhood, a feature I'd never once actually used with intention before. I found myself remembering, with new and uncomfortable clarity, small comments Julian had made over the years about coworkers, about a woman from his old job he'd mentioned exactly twice, both times in passing, both times followed by an unusually quick change of subject that I had simply never registered as unusual until now. I remember calling my sister Denise late one night, unable to say out loud what I actually suspected, dancing around it instead, with vague questions about whether she'd ever felt like she truly knew her own husband, whether 9 years was long enough to actually know someone completely, or whether some part of every person stayed permanently hidden no matter how close you got. Denise, who has never been anyone's fool, went quiet on the other end of the line for a long moment before asking, carefully, "Marianne, is something going on with you and Julian?" And I remember lying to my own sister for the first time in my adult life, telling her I was just tired, just thinking too much, just needing sleep, because some part of me still wasn't ready to say the truth out loud, wasn't ready to make it real by giving it words. I didn't know it yet, sitting in my car in that driveway, or standing frozen at the bottom of those stairs, but I had already crossed a line I could never fully walk back from. I had started, without fully choosing to, the long and lonely process of investigating my own marriage. And once that process begins, I've come to understand, there is no version of it that ends with you simply putting everything back the way you found it. In the weeks immediately following that afternoon on the stairs, I found myself doing something I've never fully admitted to anyone, not even Denise, not even Dr. Bennett, until nearly a year into our sessions together. I started testing him. Small, careful, almost scientific tests, designed to see whether the warmth I'd heard through that cracked sliding door could ever be summoned, even briefly, in my direction. I brought up one evening a half-formed idea I'd been quietly considering for months, going back to school, part-time, to finally pursue something closer to the marine biology I'd abandoned as a girl. Not as a career change exactly, just as something for myself, something unrelated to being anyone's wife or anyone's audience. I watched Julian's face carefully as I said it, looking for that same unguarded ease, that same real laugh. What I got instead was warm, supportive, entirely appropriate. "I think that's a wonderful idea. You should absolutely look into it," delivered with the same practiced generosity he'd have offered a coworker's minor announcement. Kind, correct, utterly without the particular aliveness I'd heard through that door. I tried it again a week later, telling him honestly about a fear I'd never voiced before, that I sometimes worried I'd never fully grieved my mother, that the wall I'd built around that loss in college had maybe never actually come down, just gotten better hidden. This was, I want to be clear, a genuinely vulnerable thing for me to say. The kind of admission that, 9 years earlier, on my couch, had produced the deepest intimacy I'd ever felt with another person. This time, Julian's response was tender, well-practiced, clearly sincere in its own way. He held my hand. He said the right things. He offered to help me find a grief counselor. And it was, I noted, with a coldness that frightened me even as I felt it, almost identical in shape to the comfort he'd have offered anyone, delivered from the same well-worn script of attentive, supportive husband, rather than arising freshly, specifically, from the particular fact that it was me, his wife of 9 years, sitting across from him. I stopped testing him after about a month of this, not because I ran out of things to test, but because I couldn't bear what I kept finding. Every test confirmed the same growing certainty. I could reliably access competent, generous, well-calibrated Julian. I could not, no matter what I tried, no matter how much vulnerability I offered him, reliably access the man I'd heard laughing on that porch. That version of him, I was slowly, painfully coming to understand, wasn't a switch he could flip toward me on command. It simply didn't live in our marriage anymore, if it ever fully had. I want to tell you what it's actually like to investigate your own marriage, because it is nothing like what you'd expect from movies, nothing like the dramatic montages of rifled through drawers and confrontational phone calls. There's no single dramatic scene, No shouting, no slammed doors, no dishes thrown against a wall. It's quieter than that, and immeasurably lonelier. It's sitting across the breakfast table from someone you've shared a bed with for 9 years, passing them the coffee, asking about their day in the same easy tone you always have, while a separate, colder part of your mind runs a continuous, silent background check on every single word that comes out of their mouth. I started small, almost accidentally at first. I began paying attention, really paying attention, in a way I hadn't allowed myself to in years, maybe ever, to the actual shape of Julian's affection, moment by moment, room by room. And once I started looking, really looking, I couldn't unsee the pattern that emerged, a pattern so consistent, once I finally saw it, that I was almost embarrassed it had taken me 9 years to notice. He had versions of himself, not simply two, not merely public Julian and private Julian, the ordinary duality most people carry between their professional and personal selves. More than that, more granular than that. There was the Julian who showed up at my company holiday dinners, effortlessly charming my colleagues, remembering names after being told them only once, quoting things I'd mentioned to him weeks earlier about my work with just enough specificity to make me look impressive by association, without ever quite stealing the spotlight from me. There was the Julian who appeared, almost instantly, whenever I was upset about something. A bad day, a fight with a friend, grief about my mother resurfacing unexpectedly around the holidays, who could produce comfort on command, tailored precisely to what I needed in that exact moment, who somehow always knew whether I wanted to be held in silence or talked through it out loud. And there was a third Julian, the one I had only just discovered existed at all, standing frozen at the bottom of our staircase 3 weeks earlier, warm and unguarded and easy in a way I had never once, in 9 years, been given directly. I called my sister Denise again, this time unable to hide behind vague late-night questions about marriage in the abstract. I asked her something I had genuinely never asked anyone in 9 years of being married to Julian. Has Julian ever asked you what you need? Not what you think about something, not your opinion, not advice, what you actually need in a given moment. She went quiet on the other end of the phone for a long stretch of time, long enough that I checked to see if the call had dropped, and then she said something that has stayed lodged in me every single day since. I don't think I've ever heard him ask anyone that, she said slowly, working it out loud as she spoke. I always just thought that was his personality, that he's naturally a giver, not an asker. But now that you say it like that, I actually can't think of a single time. I remember sitting on my kitchen floor, back against the cabinets, phone pressed hard against my ear, feeling something shift permanently and irreversibly in how I understood the previous 9 years of my life. It was such a small observation on its surface, and yet it explained, in a single sentence, something I had felt but never articulated. The strange, persistent sense, even in our happiest years, that Julian's attention always flowed in one direction, toward me, never from me back to him, not in the way that actually mattered, not as an equal, mutual curiosity about who the other person was underneath the roles we played for each other. Once I had that thread, I couldn't stop pulling it. I started noticing things I had cataloged without ever consciously registering them for years, small observations filed away and forgotten because none of them, on their own, seemed significant enough to examine. The way Julian's stories about his own past would shift, subtly, depending on who was in the room. Not outright lies, exactly. Nothing so crude or easily disprovable. Just optimized. With my more liberal colleagues, his opinions on certain social issues would soften and shift in ways that always seemed to align, a little too neatly, with whoever he was trying to connect with. With his more conservative uncle at family gatherings, the same underlying stories would take on a slightly different shape, emphasizing different values, without ever technically contradicting themselves. The way he'd mirror not just opinions but humor, cadence, even specific vocabulary, so seamlessly, so naturally, that you would never catch it happening in real time, only in retrospect, only if you were cruel enough to yourself to compare notes across different rooms, different years, different versions of the same stories. I found myself for the first time in my adult life doing something that felt both ridiculous and, at the same time, completely necessary. Something I would have found almost unimaginable a year earlier. I began quietly, methodically researching my own husband. Not because I suspected a specific nameable crime, not yet, but because I needed to know, with a hunger that surprised me in its intensity, whether the man I had built an entire life with actually existed as I understood him, or whether I had spent 9 years in a relationship with a remarkably convincing reflection of my own needs, my own wounds, my own hopes, projected back at me with such precision that I had mistaken the reflection for another person entirely. I searched his name alongside old employers he'd mentioned only briefly. I found a LinkedIn profile for a woman who'd worked at one of them during the years he claimed to have worked there too, sent her a message so carefully worded it took me nearly an hour to write, and never heard back, which told me either nothing at all or everything, depending on the day I happened to think about it. I started keeping a second, more organized version of my folder. Dates, small inconsistencies, a slowly growing timeline that I worked on only late at night, after Julian had gone to sleep. My laptop's brightness turned down low enough that no light would spill under the bedroom door. I remember feeling, during those weeks, like two entirely separate people were living inside my body. One of them made dinner, asked about his day, laughed at his jokes, slept beside him every night with an ease that must have looked, from the outside, completely genuine. The other one stayed up until 2 in the morning, cross-referencing dates, feeling something cold and clear-eyed settling permanently into the center of her chest. I want to be honest about something that surprised me during this period, something I didn't expect, and have never fully explained to anyone, not even Denise. I wasn't only afraid during those weeks. I was also, in some strange and uncomfortable way, more alive than I had been in years. Sharper, more attentive, more myself, in a way that unsettled me deeply once I noticed it. As though some part of me that had been quietly dimmed for a very long time, without my full awareness, was finally being allowed to switch back on. The break, when it finally came from a direction I never once anticipated. Julian's college roommate, a man named Corbin Hayes, who I had met maybe twice in 9 years, both times at holiday parties where he'd seemed pleasant but forgettable, reached out to me completely out of nowhere on a Wednesday afternoon in early spring. The message was careful, clearly labored over, starting with a line that has stayed burned into my memory word for word. This is strange to say, and I've rewritten this message about 6 times, but I think you should know something, and I don't know who else to tell. We met for coffee 2 days later, at a place far enough from our usual neighborhood that I understood, even before he said anything, that Corbin had chosen it deliberately, for privacy. He was visibly uncomfortable the entire time, turning his cup in small circles on the table, the way people are when they're about to hand you something that will permanently reshape your understanding of your own life, and they know it, and they're not entirely sure they have the right to be the one doing it. He told me, slowly, carefully, choosing each word like it might detonate something, that Julian had done this before. Not cheated, necessarily. Corbin was almost painfully careful not to use that word, because he genuinely wasn't certain, even now, that it was the correct frame for what he'd witnessed. He told me about a woman named Whitney Marsh, Julian's serious girlfriend for nearly 4 years, before he ever met me, a relationship I knew almost nothing real about beyond Julian's brief, dismissive, well-rehearsed characterization of her as unstable, needy, someone it just wasn't healthy to stay with. Corbin's version was entirely different, and it landed in my chest like something physical. He described Whitney as warm, grounded, genuinely well-loved by everyone in their friend group at the time, the kind of person other people gravitated toward instinctively. He told me that watching Julian with her, in the early years especially, had felt, to Corbin, disturbingly, uncannily similar to what he now saw watching Julian with me at those holiday parties. The same total, immersive attentiveness in the beginning. The same uncanny, almost unsettling ability to become exactly whatever Whitney needed, whenever she needed it. And then, eventually, over a period of maybe a year and a half, the same slow, almost imperceptible withdrawal of real warmth into other rooms, other late-night phone calls, other people, right up until Whitney finally left, quietly, without any dramatic public unraveling, the way people leave. Corbin said, when they finally, fully understand that a relationship was never actually about them at all, no matter how convincingly it had been staged to look that way. I asked Corbin the question I had been almost too afraid to ask anyone. The question that had been sitting underneath every other question I'd asked over the previous weeks. Did he think Julian had ever really loved her? He was quiet for a long time before he answered, long enough that I watched him decide, visibly, how honest to actually be with me. I think Julian loves being needed, he finally said. I've thought about it a lot over the years. Honestly, because it bothered me, and I never had the right way to say it to him directly. I don't know if that's the same thing as loving someone. I used to think it probably was, close enough. I'm not sure I think that anymore. I want to pause here and tell you something honestly, because I think it matters for understanding everything that came after. My first instinct, sitting there across from Corbin with my coffee going cold, untouched, was to look for a single, clean, villainous act I could point to and be angry about in a straightforward way. An affair, confirmed and named. A lie I could catch him in outright. Something with an obvious shape, a clear before and after. The kind of betrayal that comes with instructions for how you're supposed to feel about it. But the deeper I went over the following weeks, talking to Corbin twice more, finding an old mutual friend of Whitney's through a group photo, Corbin still had saved, having one brief, carefully worded phone call with a woman who confirmed almost everything Corbin had already told me, sometimes in nearly identical language. The more I understood that the actual truth was worse than a single affair, and infinitely harder to explain to people who hadn't lived inside it. There wasn't one betrayal I could isolate and grieve cleanly. There was a structure, a pattern, consistent and well-practiced across at least 2 relationships I now knew about, that had almost certainly existed in some form before me, and would almost certainly continue to exist after me, regardless of anything I decided to do next, regardless of how much I understood or didn't understand, regardless of whether I stayed or left. I remember driving home from that second conversation with Corbin in a kind of numb, careful silence, both hands on the wheel, taking a longer route than necessary because I wasn't ready yet to walk back into a house that suddenly felt like it belonged to someone I had never actually met. That night, I finally opened the folder on my laptop that I had started weeks earlier without knowing what it was actually for. The phone, the porch call, Renata's careful silence, and now this. Corbin's account, Whitney's name, a pattern with actual edges to it instead of just a vague, unshakable feeling. And I finally understood, sitting alone at my kitchen table at nearly 1 in the morning, what I had been building this entire time. It wasn't evidence of a single crime, a single betrayal I could confront him about and demand an apology for. It was evidence of a person, proof, if only for myself, that the man I loved, the man I had built 9 years of my life around, and the man who actually factually existed underneath all of it, were not, and had perhaps never once been, the same person at all. I thought, that night, about Renata's careful silence every time Julian's name came up, and I finally understood, it wasn't discomfort or awkwardness. It was protection. She had known, or at least strongly suspected, something for years, and had chosen, out of some combination of loyalty to me and uncertainty about how to say it, to simply say nothing at all. I called her the next morning, and this time, when I asked her directly, she didn't deflect. She told me quietly that she'd run into Julian once, years earlier, at a coffee shop across town during a workday, when he'd told me he was at the office, sitting close to a woman Renata didn't recognize, both of them laughing in a way that made her feel, in her own words, like I was watching something I wasn't supposed to see. She said she'd told herself it was probably nothing, a coworker, an old friend, an entirely innocent explanation, and had never brought it up to me because she didn't want to plant a doubt in my marriage over something that might genuinely mean nothing. She'd been carrying that moment, alone, for almost 3 years. I wasn't angry at her. I want to be clear about that. I understood, completely, why she'd made the choice she made. because I had spent 9 years making variations of that exact same choice myself, dozens of times over, choosing not to look directly at things that unsettled me because the alternative felt too enormous, too destabilizing, too much like admitting that the life I'd built might not be standing on solid ground at all. I promised you earlier that I'd tell you the rest of what Renata eventually shared with me, because I think it matters for understanding just how long this pattern had been quietly visible to the people around us, even when I couldn't see it myself. About 2 weeks after our first honest conversation about the coffee shop, Renata called me late one night, her voice tight in a way I recognized immediately as someone working up the courage to say something difficult. She told me there was more, that the coffee shop hadn't been an isolated moment, but the clearest example of a pattern she'd noticed and quietly dismissed for years, going back almost to the beginning of our marriage. She reminded me of a work trip Julian had taken in our 3rd year together, a 4-day conference in Austin that I remembered clearly because I'd missed him terribly the entire time, counting down the hours until his flight home. Renata told me, carefully, that she'd happened to see a photo on a mutual friend's social media from that same week. A group dinner at the conference. Julian seated close beside a woman neither of us knew, his hand resting lightly on the back of her chair, in a way that Renata described as, not necessarily anything, but not necessarily nothing either. She'd scrolled past it at the time, told herself she was reading too much into an innocent photo, and never mentioned it to me because, in her words, what was I supposed to do? Show up at your door with a screenshot from a work dinner and ruin what looked, from every other angle, like the happiest marriage I knew? She told me about a Christmas party, 5 years into our marriage, where she'd watched Julian spend nearly 45 minutes in animated, private conversation with a woman from his office in a corner of the room, while I was occupied talking with his mother across the party. A conversation Julian later described to me, briefly and vaguely, as just work stuff, boring, you didn't miss anything. Renata told me she'd watched his face during that conversation and recognized, even then, without having any language for it, something she now understood, looking back with everything we both knew, as that same unguarded ease I'd finally heard for myself on our back porch. I kept telling myself I was being paranoid, or jealous on your behalf, or reading too much into things that probably meant nothing. Renata told me that night, her voice breaking slightly. I think some part of me always knew something wasn't right, but it was never anything I could point to and say, this, definitively, is wrong. It was always just a feeling, and I didn't trust myself enough to hand you a feeling and ask you to blow up your marriage over it. I told her, and I meant it completely, that I didn't blame her, that I understood, better than almost anyone could, exactly how easy it is to have a feeling, a persistent, nagging sense that something is off, and choose, again and again, to talk yourself out of it, because the alternative feels too enormous to hold. I had done exactly that, with my own evidence, for 9 years. I could hardly ask my closest friend to have done differently with hers. In the final weeks before I confronted Julian directly, I did something I hadn't planned on doing. Something that surprised even me in the moment. I drove out to see Whitney. I found her through the same mutual acquaintance who'd first mentioned her name to me at that work conference, and after a careful, hesitant email exchange, she agreed to meet me at a small park, roughly halfway between our two cities. Neutral ground, she said, for a conversation neither of us fully knew how to have. Whitney was exactly as Corbin had described her. Warm, grounded, quick to laugh even under the strange, heavy circumstances of our meeting. We sat on a bench for nearly 2 hours, and she told me, gently but without flinching from the details, about her own 4 years with Julian. The same total, immersive attentiveness at the beginning that I recognized instantly, painfully, as my own story wearing different clothes. The same slow withdrawal, over roughly 18 months, into other rooms and other conversations she was never quite allowed to see clearly. The same quiet, dignified ending, without a dramatic confrontation, because by the time she left, she told me, she no longer had the energy to demand one. I used to think it was something wrong with me, she said at one point, looking out at the park rather than at me, that I wasn't interesting enough, once the newness wore off, to keep whatever that was going. It took me a long time to understand that it was never really about me being interesting enough. It was about whether he could keep performing at the level he'd started at, forever, without it ever becoming automatic, without it ever becoming just love, the ordinary, unglamorous, everyday kind. I don't think he can. I don't think it's that he doesn't want to. I think some part of him genuinely can't. I asked her, near the end of our conversation, whether she regretted the 4 years she'd spent with him. She thought about it for a long moment before answering. "No," she said finally. "I regret how long it took me to trust what I was actually feeling instead of what I was being told to feel. But I don't regret the years themselves. Some of it was real, even if it wasn't real in the way I believed at the time. I've made my peace with that, mostly. I drove home from that park with a clarity I hadn't had before. Not comfort exactly, but something adjacent to it. I understood finally, with a completeness that Corbin's account alone hadn't quite given me, that whatever I was about to confront Julian with wasn't a single betrayal I could isolate, grieve, and move past in the ordinary way. It was a lifelong pattern, and I was neither its first, nor, without real change on his part, likely to be its last participant. That understanding didn't make the confrontation easier, but it made it, finally, unavoidable. I confronted Julian on a Tuesday evening, at our kitchen table, the same table where he'd once asked me, on our second date, what I'd wanted to be before I knew what was practical. The same table where we'd eaten thousands of ordinary dinners over 9 years. The same table I had, in some strange way, come to associate with the very beginning of us. I want you to understand something about how I approached that conversation, because I think there's a version of this story people expect to hear. Tears from the very first sentence, raised voices, accusations thrown across the room, a dramatic unraveling with all the emotional beats you'd see in a film. What actually happened was quieter than that, and in its own particular way, far more devastating, precisely because of how quiet it was. I had spent nearly 3 weeks preparing for that conversation, not in the sense of rehearsing anger, but in the sense of organizing what I actually knew into something I could say clearly, without my voice breaking apart halfway through. I laid it all out on the table between us, literally and figuratively, a folder I had printed out the night before, though I never actually needed to open it, because once I started talking, the words simply came. The second phone, hidden beneath receipts he had no reason to keep, Corbin's account of Whitney, and how closely it mirrored what I now understood about us. Renata's coffee shop memory, 3 years buried, finally surfaced, and the voice, the one I'd heard through that cracked sliding door, warm and unguarded, a voice I had never once, in 9 years of marriage, been given directly. Julian sat across from me, very still, his hands flat on the table, and I watched something happen in his face over the course of those minutes that I had genuinely never seen before in 9 years together. Not the warm, practiced mask I'd grown so used to that I'd stopped registering it as a mask at all. Not the equally practiced comfort he offered when I was upset about something, not even anger, which I had almost expected, almost braced myself for. Something closer to confusion. Genuine, unguarded confusion, as though I had handed him a question in a language he half recognized but could not quite fully translate, no matter how hard he concentrated. And then I asked him the question that had been living underneath every other question for weeks, the one I had been circling, carefully, deliberately, without letting myself say it out loud until this exact moment, at this exact table. Did you ever love me, or did you just need me to believe you did? Julian didn't answer right away. The silence stretched long enough that I found myself counting my own heartbeats, which felt, in that moment, unbearably loud. Finally he said, in a voice smaller than I had ever heard him use, "I don't know how to answer that in a way that won't sound like a lie either way." That single sentence broke something in me more completely, more permanently, than a confession ever could have, because it told me everything I needed to know, all at once, in a way that no amount of denial or admission could have matched. A man who loved you, even a man who had failed you terribly, who had cheated or lied or hurt you in ways that were unforgivable, could still answer that question, He might answer badly. He might answer with excuses, with justifications, might even lie outright to protect himself. But he would understand, on some fundamental level, what you were actually asking him. Julian's answer told me something far worse, that somewhere along the way, possibly long before he ever met me, he had lost, or perhaps never fully possessed, the ability to distinguish between loving someone and needing them to believe he did. That the two things had become, for him, functionally identical, indistinguishable from the inside, in a way I don't think even he had ever examined closely until I forced the question directly in front of him. What followed was the longest, most difficult conversation of my life, stretching well past midnight, moving from the kitchen table to the living room and back again, punctuated by long silences neither of us seemed to know how to fill. He told me, haltingly at first and then with a kind of exhausted momentum, about a childhood I had never fully heard the real version of, despite 9 years of marriage, despite thinking I knew everything important about the man I'd chosen to spend my life with. A mother, he said, who withdrew affection unpredictably, inconsistently, warm and effusive one day, cold and distant the next, with no discernible pattern he could ever learn to anticipate as a child, no matter how carefully he tried. A mother who made love feel like something you earned through performance, through being exactly what she needed in a given moment, rather than something simply, unconditionally given to you because you existed and were hers. He told me he didn't remember a single time in his life, going all the way back as far as memory allowed, when being loved for exactly who he actually was, without adjustment, without careful calibration, without earning it through some form of performance, had ever felt safe to him. Somewhere very young, he explained, in a voice that sounded, for the first time in 9 years, genuinely unguarded, he had learned a lesson so early and so thoroughly that it had never once occurred to him to question it as an adult, that being needed was reliable in a way that being known never was. Being known meant risk. Being known meant the possibility of rejection, of someone seeing the actual, unpolished truth of him and deciding it wasn't enough. But being needed, being exactly what someone else required, moment to moment, relationship to relationship, that he could control, that he had gotten, over years of quiet, largely unconscious practice, extraordinarily good at. He had been that for me. He had been that, before me, for Whitney, in the exact pattern Corbin had described almost word for word, without ever having heard Julian's own explanation. And I understood, sitting there in our living room at nearly 2 in the morning, exhausted in a way that went far beyond simple tiredness, that he had almost certainly been that, in some smaller or larger way, for someone else too, quietly, in the margins of our marriage, without it ever necessarily reaching the level of a full affair, without it needing to, because the betrayal wasn't really about physical infidelity at all. It was about where his real, unguarded, effortful free self actually lived. And it had never, not once in 9 years, fully lived with me. I don't think Julian was lying to me for 9 years. Not in the simple, deliberate sense we usually mean when we use that word. I think he genuinely, sincerely believed, in whatever way he was capable of believing anything about his own inner life, that he loved me, because being exactly what I needed, anticipating it before I even knew I needed it myself, felt to him indistinguishable from love, had felt that way his entire adult life, had probably felt that way since he was a small child, trying desperately to earn his own mother's consistency. But I had spent 9 years needing something different, something I couldn't have fully articulated until that very night. I needed to be truly known, imperfectly, inconveniently, with all my actual flaws and contradictions visible and accepted, not endlessly, expertly, exhaustingly accommodated. And those two things I finally understood, sitting across from a man I had loved for nearly a decade, are not the same thing at all. They only look identical from a certain distance, in the beginning, before you've lived close enough, long enough, to see the difference. We didn't resolve anything that night. There was no clean ending to that conversation, no moment of mutual understanding that made everything suddenly make sense. Julian went to bed first, sometime around 3 in the morning, and I stayed downstairs alone in the dark for a long time afterward, not crying, not really thinking in any organized way, just sitting with the strange, hollow, almost peaceful feeling of finally having said, out loud, the thing I had been circling for months. I want to tell you about the 4 months between that conversation at the kitchen table and the day Julian actually moved out, because I think the silence of that period says almost as much about our marriage as anything that came before it. We continued living in the same house for most of that time, in a strange, suspended arrangement neither of us had planned, but neither of us quite knew how to exit gracefully either. We slept in separate rooms almost immediately. That part, at least, felt clear and necessary to both of us. But we still, for the first several weeks, ate dinner together most nights, out of habit as much as anything else. Two people who had shared thousands of meals across 9 years, suddenly unsure how to simply stop. Those dinners were some of the strangest experiences of my life. Julian would ask about my day, and I would answer, and for a few disorienting minutes at a time, it would feel almost normal, until I'd catch myself watching him, studying his face the way I now understood he had once studied mine, trying to determine which version of him was sitting across from me in any given moment. I never fully figured out how to stop doing that. I'm not sure, honestly, that I've fully stopped even now. There was one dinner, about 6 weeks after the kitchen table conversation, that I think about more than almost any other single moment in this entire story. Julian, unprompted, started talking about a memory from early in our relationship, a weekend trip we'd taken to the coast in our 2nd year together, before we were married, when we'd gotten caught in an unexpected storm and had to shelter in a tiny, nearly empty diner for almost 3 hours, laughing about nothing in particular, genuinely delighted by the inconvenience of it. He described the memory in specific, textured detail, the smell of the diner's coffee, the way the rain had sounded against the windows, a joke I'd made that he still, apparently, thought about sometimes. I remember sitting there, watching him tell that story, feeling something I hadn't expected to feel at that point, a flicker of real hope. Because the specificity of it, the texture, felt different from the vague, polished childhood story he'd once given me about his own past. It felt, for a moment, like maybe some genuine core of unguarded connection really had existed between us, buried underneath everything else that had gone wrong. I asked him, carefully, why he was telling me this now. He was quiet for a long moment, and then he said something that has stayed with me ever since. Something that finally, fully answered a question I'd been circling since that first kitchen table conversation. Because I think that was real, he said. I think some of it, with you, was actually real. I just don't know how to explain why it stopped feeling like enough to just be that, eventually, with anyone. Why some part of me always starts looking for the next place to feel that specific, particular kind of aliveness again, instead of just staying inside it with the person I already have it with. I didn't have a response to that. I still don't think I fully do, even now. But I've come to believe, in the years since, that his answer that night was probably as honest as Julian is capable of being about himself. That some of what we had really was real, in the sense that genuine connection can exist even inside a pattern that's ultimately unsustainable, even inside a person who has never learned how to simply rest inside a steady, ordinary kind of love without needing to keep proving, to himself as much as to anyone else, that he could still generate that early, electric intensity on demand. Here is the part of this story that took me the longest to make any real peace with, and the part I think, if you've stayed with me this far, you most need to hear. Julian didn't fight for us. In the weeks that followed that long night at the kitchen table, I kept waiting, almost against my own will, some stubborn, hopeful part of me still holding on, for the version of events I'd seen play out in other people's stories, other people's marriages, the begging, the promises to change, to go to therapy together, to become, through sheer determined effort, the kind of person capable of actually being known, rather than simply being needed. I waited for him to fight, because some small, exhausted part of me still wanted him to, still wanted proof that whatever we'd had, flawed and asymmetrical as I now understood it to be, had been worth fighting to save. He didn't. Within 4 months of that conversation, Julian had moved out, moved into a rental across town, and, I learned much later, from a mutual friend who wasn't trying to hurt me, only to inform me, gently, the way you tell someone something because you believe they deserve to know, rather than to remain in the dark, begun a relationship with a woman named Kristen Farrow. Warm, by every account. Grounded. Genuinely, sincerely wonderful. According to the small handful of people who knew her and mentioned her to me. Always carefully. Always watching my face for how much I could handle hearing. I won't lie to you, sitting here telling you this now, years removed from it. For a long time, that was the part that broke me most completely. Not the second phone. Not Whitney or Corbin's careful, painful account of her. Not even the porch, or that single unguarded laugh that had first cracked everything open. It was watching, from a distance, how easily, how seamlessly, how quickly Julian simply became, by every account I heard secondhand, exactly what Kristen needed. In precisely the same effortless, uncanny way, he had once become exactly what I needed. In the exact same pattern, I now understood with a kind of sick clarity that he had almost certainly become exactly what Whitney needed before either of us. It proved, in the most painful, most thoroughly documented way possible, the exact thing I had spent months trying not to fully understand. I was never uniquely loved. I was never, despite 9 years of believing otherwise with my whole heart, the exception to some rule that governed everyone else's relationships but not ours. I was simply the current installation of something Julian had been building and rebuilding and refining across his entire adult life, possibly longer, possibly reaching all the way back to a childhood spent trying to earn a mother's inconsistent love through careful, constant performance. It took me almost 2 full years, 2 years of therapy, of long conversations with Denise on her back porch, of slowly, painstakingly rebuilding a sense of myself that didn't depend on Julian's attention to feel real, to understand that this wasn't actually the tragedy I had initially believed it to be, sitting in the wreckage of it in those first raw months. The tragedy wasn't that Julian moved on so easily, so quickly, so seemingly without grief. The actual tragedy, the one that took me far longer to see clearly, was that I had spent 9 years mistaking being perfectly, expertly, exhaustively accommodated for being truly seen. And once I finally understood the difference between those two things, really understood it, not just intellectually but in my body, in the way I approached every relationship afterward, I understood something else, something that eventually became less painful, and more simply, quietly true. Julian could never have given me what I actually wanted, no matter how long I had stayed, no matter how patiently I had waited for him to change. Because what I wanted required him to risk being known, imperfectly, inconveniently, without the safety net of constant calibration. And that was a risk. I came to believe over those 2 years of distance and reflection, he was constitutionally unable to take. Not because he was cruel, not because he didn't, in his own limited way, care about me, but because somewhere very young, long before I ever met him, he had learned that being known was the single most dangerous thing a person could risk, and nothing in the years since had ever taught him otherwise. I think about Kristen sometimes, more than I probably should, more than is entirely healthy, if I'm honest. I don't know her, I've never met her, and I probably never will, but I hope, somewhere in the years ahead of her, at some kitchen table of her own, in some ordinary evening she doesn't yet know is coming, she asks him the same question I did. And I hope, unlike me, she doesn't need 9 years, and a second phone, and a college roommate's careful confession, and a friend's 3-year-old memory of a coffee shop across town, to understand what his answer actually means. I also think, more often now than I used to, about Whitney, a woman I have still never met, whose name I only know because of a chance conversation with a stranger, and a difficult conversation with a college roommate. I wonder sometimes if she ever found her way to a version of peace about what happened to her, whether she understood, eventually, that whatever went wrong between them was never actually about anything she lacked or failed to provide. I hope, if she ever comes across a story like mine, and stories like this one travel further than you'd expect, reach people you never anticipated reaching, that some small part of it feels less lonely to have heard. There's a particular kind of grief that comes with this specific type of ending, one that I don't think gets talked about often enough, because it doesn't fit neatly into the categories we usually have for heartbreak. It's not the grief of losing someone who loved you and stopped. It's the more disorienting grief of understanding that the person you loved, the specific person you built 9 years of memories and inside jokes and shared Tuesday mornings around, may never have fully existed in the way you experienced them. That you were, in some very real sense, in a relationship with your own hopes, your own hunger to be known, reflected back at you with such precision and consistency that you mistook the reflection for another person entirely. And yet, and this is the part I want to be careful to say clearly, because I don't want this story to leave you believing that everything about those 9 years was a lie, or that you should walk away from everyone who has ever deeply understood you and immediately suspect calculation. I don't believe Julian set out, consciously, deliberately, to deceive me the way a con artist deceives a mark. I believe he was doing, with me, the only thing he had ever learned how to do to survive emotionally, becoming what was needed, because somewhere very young, being simply imperfectly himself, had never once felt safe enough to risk. That doesn't excuse the years of my life I spent inside a relationship built on that foundation without ever being told the truth of what I was actually standing on. But it does, I think, complicate the story in a way that matters, because it means this isn't simply a story about a villain and his victim. It's a story about how deeply we can misunderstand the difference between being accommodated and being loved, and how long that misunderstanding can survive, undetected, inside a life that looks, from every outside angle, completely happy. Here's what I want to leave you with, because I think it matters more than any other single thing in this story, more than the phone, more than Whitney, more than the porch. Love that arrives too fast, that understands you too completely, too immediately, without the slow, sometimes clumsy, sometimes disappointing work of actually being earned over real time. That isn't always a red flag. I want to be careful here, because I don't want anyone listening to this to walk away afraid of every early, powerful connection they ever feel with another person. Sometimes rapid understanding is simply luck, simply genuine compatibility, simply two people who happen, against long odds, to fit each other in a way that doesn't require explanation. But sometimes, and this is the part worth sitting with, worth carrying with you into whatever relationships come next in your own life, it's something else entirely. Sometimes it's a mirror, constructed with remarkable skill and often without full conscious awareness, built specifically to reflect back exactly what you needed to see, by someone who has spent their entire life learning, in ways that were never their fault to begin with. That being reflected is infinitely safer than being real. So, I'll leave you with the question I finally had to ask myself, sitting alone in that house 9 months after Julian moved out, surrounded by furniture we'd chosen together, in rooms that still, in certain lights, felt like they belonged to both of us. How would you actually know the difference? If someone learned exactly what to say to keep you close, every wound you'd never spoken aloud, every quiet, unspoken wish, every hunger you'd carried since childhood without ever fully naming it, even to yourself, would you even want to find out it wasn't real? Or would some part of you, understandably, choose to keep believing, because the alternative felt like too much to survive? I didn't have an easy answer to that question the night I first asked it. I'm not sure I have a fully easy answer to it even now, years later, on the other side of all of this. But I know, with a certainty I didn't have before, that the question itself is worth asking. Early, honestly, before 9 years pass and you find yourself standing at the bottom of a staircase, listening to a voice you don't recognize, wondering what you've actually been living inside all along. People ask me sometimes, when this story comes up in conversation, because it does come up, more than you'd think, once you've lived through something like this and stopped hiding it, whether I regret the 9 years. It's usually asked gently, carefully, by someone who genuinely wants to understand, rather than someone looking for a tidy moral to the story. And I've noticed my answer has changed, gradually, over the 2 years since Julian left. In the beginning, right after, I would have said yes without hesitation. 9 years felt, in those raw first months, like 9 years stolen from me. 9 years spent loving a carefully constructed reflection instead of a real person. 9 years I could never get back, and would never have chosen if I'd known the truth from the start. I don't fully believe that anymore. Not because what happened stopped hurting. It still does, in quieter, more manageable ways, on certain anniversaries, in certain rooms of that house I still live in. But because I've come to understand that the version of me who exists today, the one who finally, at 41 years old, understands the difference between being accommodated and being truly known, could only have arrived here through exactly what I went through. I don't think I would have learned that distinction any other way. I certainly didn't understand it at 32, laughing across that dinner table, grateful beyond words for a man who seemed to see me so completely. So now, when people ask, I tell them something closer to the truth as I actually understand it today. I don't regret the 9 years. I regret how long it took me to trust the quiet, persistent feeling that something wasn't quite right, underneath everything that looked, from every outside angle, like exactly the marriage I'd always wanted. I regret dismissing Renata's careful silences instead of asking her, directly, years earlier, what she actually thought. I regret not asking Julian's mother more questions at that first lunch, not noticing how carefully her son calibrated his laughter around her. But I don't regret loving him, even now, even knowing everything I know. I think that's possible. To genuinely, fully regret the structure of a thing while still holding real tenderness for parts of what happened inside it. I don't think those two feelings cancel each other out. I think, most of the time, they simply have to learn to live side by side. What I would tell myself 9 years ago. If I could sit down across from myself at that dinner party 9 years ago, watching Julian ask me what I'd wanted to be before I knew what was practical, I don't think I would tell her to leave. I don't think that's actually the lesson of this story. Even now, even with everything I know, what I would tell her is this. Pay attention not just to how someone makes you feel in the beginning, but to how they behave when you're not actively performing gratitude for them. Notice whether they can tolerate being bored with you, ordinary with you, disappointing to you in small human ways, without needing to immediately fix it, smooth it over, or produce a fresh wave of intensity to paper over the gap. Notice whether they ask you questions because they're curious about the answer or because the answer is useful information. Notice, especially, whether the people who love them, their oldest friends, their family, the people who've watched them across multiple chapters of their life, ever seem to go quiet, carefully, protectively, whenever a certain subject comes up. That quiet is data. I wish I had understood, 9 years ago, that quiet is data. I would also tell her something kinder. Something I've only fully come to believe in the past year. That falling for what Julian offered wasn't a character flaw, wasn't evidence of poor judgment or excessive naivety. It was evidence that she was a person capable of real intimacy, hungry for genuine understanding in a way that isn't shameful, isn't something to armor herself against permanently. The lesson isn't to become suspicious of everyone who seems to understand you quickly. The lesson is to let that quick understanding be the beginning of a much longer process of actually finding out whether it's true. Over time, through friction, through the ordinary disappointments that real, sustainable love has to be able to survive, rather than mistaking the beginning for the whole story. I don't know exactly who I'll be 5 years from now, or 10. I don't know if I'll fall in love again, or what that will look like if I do, or whether I'll recognize the warning signs faster next time, or make some entirely new mistake I can't yet anticipate. But I know, with a certainty I didn't have 9 years ago, sitting across from a stranger who somehow already seemed to know me completely, that certainty itself is worth questioning, gently, patiently, before you build 9 years of your life on top of it. Thank you for sitting with this story tonight. Thank you for letting Marianne's 9 years mean something, even secondhand, even through a screen, even from wherever you're watching this from right now. I'll see you in the next one. 1 year later. It's been just over a year now since Julian moved his last box out of the house on Alderbrook Lane, and I want to tell you honestly how things actually look from where I'm standing today, because I think the aftermath of a story like this deserves as much honesty as the story itself. I still live in that house. I almost didn't. For the first few months, every room felt saturated with a version of him that no longer existed, or maybe had never existed at all, and I seriously considered selling it, starting somewhere entirely new where nothing would remind me of the wraparound porch he'd claimed, falsely, to have dreamed about his whole life. Denise talked me out of it, gently, over several long conversations on that same porch, reminding me that the house itself hadn't lied to me. Only the man who used to sit on it with a lemonade in his hand pretending it meant something it didn't. She was right, in the end. The porch is mine now. I sit out there most evenings, and it means, finally, exactly what it looks like it means. A quiet place to sit at the end of a day. I went to therapy for the first time in my life, starting about 6 weeks after that conversation at the kitchen table, and I want to say clearly that it changed the entire trajectory of how I understood, not just what happened with Julian, but who I had been, quietly, unconsciously, for most of my adult life leading up to him. My therapist, a patient, sharp woman named Dr. Bennett, helped me understand something I hadn't been ready to see on my own, that my own hunger to be completely, immediately understood, the hunger that had made me so vulnerable to exactly what Julian offered on that very first date, had roots of its own, reaching back to a childhood where my mother's illness had made consistent attention feel scarce and precious, something to be grateful for, wherever you found it, rather than something you were entitled to question or examine closely. I don't say this to excuse anything Julian did. I say it because understanding my own part in the pattern, not blame, but pattern, has been the single most important thing I've done in the past year to make sure I don't walk, unknowingly, into another version of the same story. Renata and I are closer now than we were even before any of this happened, which surprised me, given how much guilt she carried for staying quiet for so long. I told her, more than once, that I understood completely, because I had spent 9 years making that exact same choice myself, in smaller ways, every single day. We talk now regularly about the things we notice, not in a paranoid way, not treating every new relationship in either of our lives as a potential threat, but in a way that feels, finally, like real friendship, honest, unafraid of difficult observations, willing to say the uncomfortable thing out loud instead of filing it away in careful silence. I haven't dated anyone seriously in the year since Julian left, and I want to be honest that this isn't entirely by choice. Some of it is simple fear, the ordinary kind that anyone who's been through something like this would recognize. But some of it, I think, is something healthier, a genuine unwillingness to rush toward the next person who understands me a little too quickly, a little too completely, before I've had the chance to actually get to know them slowly, imperfectly, the way real understanding is supposed to build over real time, with real friction, real disagreement, real moments where you don't feel perfectly seen and have to decide whether you can live with that, whether that's actually what healthy love feels like most of the time. Imperfect, occasionally missing each other, and choosing again and again to keep trying anyway. I heard, secondhand, a few months ago, that things ended between Julian and Kristen. I don't know the details, and I made a deliberate choice not to go looking for them, the way I once might have. I felt something complicated when I heard it. Not vindication exactly, though I won't pretend there wasn't a small human part of me that felt something like it for a fleeting moment. Mostly, I felt something closer to sadness. Sadness for Kristen, whoever she is, wherever she is now, and whatever version of this exact story she's currently trying to make sense of on her own. And sadness too, in a way I didn't expect to still feel, for Julian himself, for whatever it was, all those years ago, that taught a small child that being loved for exactly who he was could never be trusted, and that he has, as far as I know, still never gone looking for the kind of help that might actually teach him otherwise. I've told this story as honestly and completely as I know how to tell it, more honestly in some ways than I've told it to anyone in my life outside of Dr. Bennett's office, because I think somewhere inside it, some of you listening right now will recognize a version of your own life. Maybe it's not a marriage. Maybe it's a friendship that felt, in the beginning, like being truly known for the first time. Maybe it's a parent whose love always seemed to depend, in ways you couldn't quite name as a child, on being exactly what they needed you to be in any given moment. Maybe it's someone you dated for 6 intense consuming weeks that somehow felt, at the time, like 6 years worth of connection. The underlying pattern, I've come to believe, is the same wherever it shows up in a life. Someone who understood you so quickly, so completely, so seamlessly, that you never once stopped to ask yourself the harder, more uncomfortable question, whether you were actually being loved or simply, expertly, being studied. I genuinely love to know in the comments below, because I read every single one of them, even months after a video goes up. Have you ever looked back on someone in your life, a partner, a friend, a parent, someone from years ago you still think about sometimes, and realized, often long after the fact, that they knew exactly what to say to you, not because they loved you in the way you believed at the time, but because they had learned you, carefully, the way you'd learn a language or a role? What was the moment it became clear to you? Was there a version of the voice on the porch in your own story? A single, unguarded moment that told you more than years of careful performance ever had? If this story meant something to you, if some part of it landed somewhere true, there's another one waiting on this channel that I think you'll find just as difficult and just as necessary. It's about a woman who spent 20 years believing her own silence was a form of strength, a quiet dignity she'd chosen for herself, until she finally understood, much later than she would have liked, what that silence had actually cost her, and everyone who loved her, over 2 decades of never once saying what she actually needed out loud. If you found something true in Marianne's story tonight, I think you'll find something in hers too, waiting for you whenever you're ready for it. Before we dive deeper into that next story, though, let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. I love seeing how far these stories travel, how many different lives, in how many different corners of the world, end up recognizing some piece of themselves in someone else's difficult chapter. And if you're new here, if this is the first time you've found your way to this channel, welcome to the Untold Mind. We tell the stories that don't usually get told out loud, the quiet ones, the ones that live in kitchens and staircases and back porches rather than headlines. Because I've come to believe, more and more with every story we tell, that those are usually the ones that need telling the most. Subscribe if this found you at the right moment. There's more waiting for you here.